And we're good. We're up for recording. Shira, how are you?
Doing all right. It's in the mid 60s today in New York City, so I am a happy camper for right now.
Well, you're a happy camper, as we just talked about, because all the viewers know that we have a little preliminary conversation before I hit record. This sudden burst of warm weather has wreaked havoc with my allergies. So I'm probably sounding a little bit different because I have absolutely no ability to breathe through my nose right now. So that's just getting it out there. But I'm glad you're happy. I'm glad you're here. I want to thank you very much for doing this episode of Did You Know That? ? Because I think folks are going to find this very interesting. This is going to be a good topic that we're going to talk about. So if you are a returning visitor, you have my thanks for being loyal, and I hope you're subscribed with the bell so you get notified. Those of you just joining us, make sure you hit the subscribe button and the bell, because then you'll get notified when all new episodes go up on Thursday mornings. If you do like this video or previous videos, make sure you give us a like, because that does help the channel where we can. For those of you who don't know, my name is Sean O'Rourke, and when I am not interviewing interesting people about interesting topics, I am actually a cyber liability consultant for an insurance brokerage firm called Combs and Company. And what that means is I essentially prepare companies to be hacked, but we'll talk about that at a later date. Shira, why don't you tell the fine folks who you are and what you do?
Thanks, Sean. Thanks for having me. Grateful to have the opportunity to chat. My name is Shira Fisher. I am the Chief Development Officer at BRC. BRC is a homeless services organization that serves over 10,000 men and women a year who are experiencing homelessness in New York City. And I oversee our fundraising and communications efforts. And I'm just thrilled to be here today.
Well, and I'm thrilled to have you, because this is a conversation that I actually thought about just walking down Broadway by our office, because there is a gentleman who has essentially a home on the street outside of a store there. And I knew that you worked in this arena. So I figured having you on would be a great way to answer some questions and possibly raise some answers that people haven't thought about. So I'm going to get started with a simple question that will not have a simple answer. So anybody watching, if you expect a 3-minute answer to all the problems here, you might as well leave now, because that's not going to the way it works. But in New York City, just focusing on New York City at the moment, what are the leading causes of homelessness?
Sure. So as you said, it's a complex question. And I first like to start this conversation talking about institutions that are in our government and in our society. So I think the number one cause of homelessness is a failure of those institutions, well-intentioned, but a failure nonetheless. So whether it's our criminal justice system or our criminal injustice system, whether it is housing policies and redlining policies that have affected people of color in a profound ways, whether it's our education, failures of our education system or child protective services system, all of these come together, including the failures of our mental health care system and how we treat people that are suffering from addiction. All of those kind of failures come together to create an environment where people experiencing homelessness can thrive, for lack of a better word. So, when you look at homelessness in New York City specifically, there's about 55,000 individuals living sheltered and unsheltered. So when I say sheltered and unsheltered, I mean 55,000 folks who are sleeping in homeless shelters every night. Of those, about 12,000 families are included in that number. And there are anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000. The number is questioned, right? It's hard to know exactly how many people are living unsheltered, but when I say unsheltered, I mean people living on the streets, like you see by your office, or on trains, subways, transit hubs, etc. Of those living sheltered and unsheltered, over a third have some sort of behavioral health diagnosis, which could include a mental illness, substance abuse, and other things. And many are experiencing economic issues that have led them to seek the shelter system. What makes homelessness in New York City unique is that there is a right to shelter for every individual in our city. In 1979, there was a case, Callahan versus Carey, that basically said that the city is not doing enough to provide shelter for people experiencing homelessness. Right. And ever since that case was in favor of the defendant saying that, yeah, the state, the city has to legally give shelter to anybody who needs it. The shelter system really changed in New York City. So now anybody you can walk off a bus and land in New York and turn to the New York City homeless shelter system and say, I need a place to stay tonight. And they are legally mandated to give you a bed. And so anywhere from that person who's just arriving in New York to someone who's a lifelong New Yorker who needs a bed will get it. So homelessness is a unique reality in New York City. Even though we see it across the country and all over the world, there are some unique factors in New York that differentiates it from other places that you see homelessness.
So that right to shelter, just a quick aside, that's, as far as you know, only in New York City. Doesn't exist anywhere else in the United States?
So as far as I know, that is unique to New York City. I'm pretty sure in this country and maybe even in the world. But New York City since the end of 1979 has had a right to shelter. And there's a lot of reasons why homelessness exploded in New York City. It really has exploded in the last 40 to 50 years. One of the reasons is that there used to be a lot of single room occupancy units in New York City for people who were living in poverty, for people who were struggling with health issues. And then tax incentives changed in the 70s to really push developers away from, refurbishing buildings that way or building new buildings that way. In the 50s and 60s, there was a real push to deinstitutionalize people, both because of reports of horrible treatment of people that were being institutionalized, but also with the advent of psychotropic drugs, people felt that we could serve folks better outside of an institutional setting. So in the 70s, there was a huge kind of flood of folks coming out of institutions. However, the government did not take the tax savings that was now happening because these folks weren't institutionalized anymore and putting it into supportive programs. So a lot of these people just kind of were let out of institutions, didn't have the skill sets that were necessary to thrive independently because they had been institutionalized and everything, right? Like everything was taken care of, laundry, cooking food, when to eat, how to eat, right? All these different things. And all of a sudden there was no supportive communities, or there weren't enough supportive communities for them to turn to. So these are some of the causes of why homelessness exploded in New York City over the last couple of decades, and continue to this day.
Well, it's still a point of contention for a lot of people as to whether or not institutionalization is a better form of treatment if the institution itself can be a quality place and quality run, as opposed to letting them out. And I mean, you hear New Yorkers argue about it every day as they walk by homelessness or get on the subway and there's a homeless person who's taken up the entire car or something along those lines. So while it happened decades ago, it is still a major point of contention for a lot of people.
Oh yeah, I mean, we see the ramifications to this day. There's no question that certain people would most benefit from being institutionalized, but the vast majority of folks would thrive if they had a permanent supportive housing community to live in. So, a home that's their home, but easy access to and regular access to strong, effective supportive services.
Like what kind of supportive services?
Oh, I mean, so, at BRC, we believe in meeting, just to give you the context of the story, right? We believe in meeting each individual where they're at. And we have a robust continuum of services to help serve each individual, right? There's no A, B, C, D. There's no like perfect cookie cutter answer for everybody. Each person has their own their own trauma, their own needs, their own path that they need to walk. So supportive services can look like behavioral health supportive services, right? So if someone has a mental illness, having psychiatrists, case manager check on you regularly, make sure you're taking your medications, noticing, I noticed that they had been keeping their apartment clean, and the last few weeks it hasn't been looking so good. I wonder if that's a red flag that maybe they haven't been taking their medications, or they're struggling more than usual, right? If you have supportive staff that are there, that know you, that you have a trusting and respecting relationship with, the chances of kind of catching you before you really fall far are much stronger. Vocational services, right? For folks that are able to work, right? Having not only vocational services that like get you a job, but vocational services that teach you how to put together a resume, how to dress for a resume, how to, we have folks that are coming out of the prison system, right? And we have a lot of folks that have experience with the criminal justice system, which I think says more about how we criminalize poverty in this country than it necessarily says about who they are. But how do you explain an 8-year gap on your resume when you were in prison?
Yeah.
Right? Like, yeah. Right? But like, so working with folks.
I was an independent contractor.
Right. It's challenging. And how do you approach these questions? And how do you use the fact that maybe you picked up skills while you were in prison, to your advantage? It gives you a different outlook on life. But how do you handle these very difficult issues? So this is just an example of some of the supportive services, but at the end of the day, it's really about achieving stability and building the life that you want to build for yourself. And I think for many of our clients who, in many cases, have experienced pretty intense trauma in their lives, they don't believe it themselves that they can do it. They don't believe that they can have it. And because they've been told by the system, or they've been told by people in their lives that, they can't, or they're worthless, or they don't have what it takes, or all these different kinds of things. So at BRC, we see an individual, we don't see their problems, right? We look at them as a person. What is it that you want out of your life? What opportunities do you wish you had that you think are out of reach for you? And whatever that is, then we put together a plan with them. And this is where the supportive services come in to help get them to where they want to be, to get them to be who they want to be. In many cases, the survival skills that it takes to make it on the streets are incredible. These are assets. These are positives. These are attributes that we want to build upon, but they've always been kind of looked at as a negative. And how do we flip the script? And how do we empower people to advocate for themselves, to believe that they can change and they can make their lives better? That's where supportive services come in, and then to sustain it, right?
So let's stay on this line of question, because as everybody knows who watches the channel, I always have a list of questions here, but I hardly ever get to them all because the guest says something and then we go off in a totally different direction. But we're going to stay on this because at BRC, do people come to you? Do you proactively go out and offer your services to homeless individuals? How does that relationship start? And then I'm going to talk about how it evolves once it does start.
Sure. So the answer is both. Oftentimes people are referred to our programs from assessment shelters. We have some assessment shelters ourselves, but there's many, many assessment shelters around the city. An assessment shelter is the first place that you go to when you enter the Department of Homeless Services system. And it's essentially a shelter where you get a bed and you're assessed, right? Like, why is it that you're experiencing homelessness? Right. Is it an economic issue? Is it a domestic violence issue? Is it a sudden change in your living environment that you couldn't control? Is it, a behavioral health issue? Whatever it is, we assess that. And then depending on what your assessment says, you get sent to various new programs for treatment, right? So we get a lot of clients that way, but we have a really robust outreach program that primarily focuses on the subways and transit hubs, although we do have some contracts with some business improvement districts around the city for street outreach as well. And the relationship starts there. And one of the first things that I learned at BRC that was shocking to me at the time, but now it makes perfect sense, is that it takes an average of 80 to 100 touch points with a client living on the streets before they feel safe and willing to come in and try one of our programs. And then, because I was like, so wait, someone comes up to you, you're living in Central Park, you're living on the train, whatever it may be, and someone says like, I have a warm bed and food and like a shower and everything for you, and people say no, like that was shocking to me. But now that I've been in this line of work, it's been 13 years that I've been at BRC, I get it, right? Many of the people who are living on the streets or the trains have been in and out of the shelter system, and the system failed them. Many of the shelters in New York are,
Let me jump in real quick. So when you say the shelter system, I take it you mean New York City's shelter system, not necessarily BRC or another private organization.
Yeah, and so the shelter system it's a difficult place to be, right? They're oftentimes
you hear stories all the time. So
oftentimes they're not well kept. Sometimes they're not safe, right? People get their belongings stolen, they get physically attacked. And there's also a lot of rules at shelters. There's curfews. So if you come in after curfew, you get kicked out. For folks that have behavioral health issues, if you come in high, you get kicked out. So a lot of people feel like they're adults. They don't want to be treated like a child. And they rather take, with all the negatives that come with living on the street, they rather live on the street where they can be in control of their own lives and not be kind of told what they can and cannot do, not have a curfew and things like that. So it takes a while to build a trusting relationship where, first of all, if someone came up to me and said, hey, get in this van, Shira, I've got like a great dinner waiting for you. I would be like, get the hell away from me. And I would run away as fast as I can. And for our clients, it's no different. Like, who are we? Who are we coming and saying?
You teach your kids that.
Absolutely.
If a stranger comes up to you, you yell and you run.
Absolutely. So our outreach workers come from a place of respect and dignity, and they just introduce themselves. They let the person know that they're here if they ever need anything, that there is a bed and a bed waiting for them when they're ready. And for some folks, that's right away, but for some, that could take months, years until they're willing to try. So clients come to us in different ways, and we've adapted over the years to better serve our clients. So just to give you an example, we look at our clients as customers, and we are a very data-driven organization. We use data to help us solve problems that are impeding our clients from achieving the success that we think is possible for them, that we know is possible for them. So one example is chronically homeless individuals. Chronically homeless individuals are people who are experiencing homelessness for 9 months or more. Sometimes that means years, and in some cases even decades, which is just shocking. I mean, to be able to survive on the streets of New York City for 20, 30 years is truly a monumental feat. And many do not make it that long. But when at the time Mayor Bloomberg came into office, he was a very data-driven mayor, and he was looking at the data and he's like, what the heck? Why are there people, spending years and years on the streets? What can we do about it? So we looked at our data, and a lot of the clients who we would go up to on the subways or we'd go up to on the streets would say, I don't want to be treated like a child. I'd rather be out here, even though it sucks sleeping outside, and I'd rather do that. So we listened and we adapted, and we created, with private money, we were able to do a model called the Safe Haven model, which was based on harm reduction philosophy, which is it's better to just get someone off the street at first, even if they're not, moving forward in their treatment at that time. Let's just start there. So a safe haven means that you get a bed, you get a shower, you get food, but there's really no expectations that you have to meet. There's no curfew. You can, if you're high or you're drunk, you're allowed into the program. You cannot bring weapons or drug or alcohol paraphernalia onto the premises. Those are the only rules. But aside from that, you are in charge. There's supportive services ready when you're ready to take them and to work with our staff, but you do not have to utilize those supportive services right away if you do not want to. And what we found was that a lot of people who were labeled chronically homeless came off the street for the first time. At first, many folks, continued on with the similar habits that they had before, but slowly but surely they realized, like, hey, the guy next to me, I heard, got his own apartment, or the guy next to me has been clean for, I heard is getting clean. I'm like, how could I do that? Right? Like, so slowly but surely, folks that were so service resistant for so long were now moving forward in their recovery and moving forward with achieving, a better life for themselves.
So I have to ask you, because I like to play devil's advocate every once in a while. So, well, I have two things. One, let's stay with BRC and the program that you just mentioned. You mentioned that you're not allowed drugs or alcohol in the environment. How do you make sure that they don't get in? And what do you do if you find them?
So that's a good question. So there's certain things that are just illegal. And if someone is committing a crime, or if someone is doing something illegal, like, the police will be called, right? And other things can just be, can be taken away. Some of our programs do have, metal detectors, or do have, the handheld detectors.
Yeah.
When appropriate, when necessary. But again, it's a harm reduction program. So the goal is to make it as easy as possible for people to safely get off the street, right? So as long as we feel that they are in a safe environment, and that the other people that are in that program are in a safe environment with someone there, then it's harm reduction. It's like the least amount of involvement as possible.
So you don't search them as they come in and out every day?
Well, like I said, like,
aside from the metal detectors and what have you, I mean, you're not patting them down and whatnot, unless you find something.
Right.
Okay, so then what happens if you do find something?
Like I said, if it's something that's illegal, and so either something is taken away, or if it's something's illegal happening, the police will be called.
Okay.
We're not looking to break the rules or anything like that. We are just trying to create an environment where people have the most chance of success for moving forward.
But I assume, let's say somebody's walking in and they're trying to sneak a bottle through.
Yeah, they'll get taken away.
You're just going to take it away. If they're bringing drug paraphernalia through, same thing, or trying to bring a weapon through, I assume it's just taken away unless there's some sort of use of that on your properties, on BRC properties and the such.
Yeah,
brings it to the illegal side.
Yeah, I don't know the details of, like, okay, if you find this or if you find that, right. But like I said, it's about, if something illegal is happening, the police will be involved, and if not, we are just keep trying to encourage people to move on with supportive services and get to a healthier place.
So then let's compare that to the city's shelter system. And you mentioned some of the pushback against some of the rules that they have in place. It is a government agency. It does answer to a whole series of taxpayers to a certain extent. We like to say that. We know it doesn't really, but it does on the surface. Are the rules really that onerous, or is it just that the people coming into it have never lived under any kind of rules, so they find those chafing no matter what they are?
Honestly, I think this comes down to effort versus impact, right? And we talk a lot about that at BRC. There are a lot of places and there are a lot of contracts that measure input, but not necessarily throughput. So it's about, there's a right to shelter. We need to provide shelter for everyone who needs it. And there's an understanding that supportive services are ideal. Right. But that doesn't mean that every organization that is running a shelter is having the impact in the client's lives and on the lives of everyone in the city that it should be. So trying to push the system to move towards a system that rewards impact, right, and rewards organizations that have really successful impact numbers and results for it's really not about the numbers, but it have successful impact en masse for the people that organization is serving, versus, okay, you're doing the job, you're making the effort, but is the impact what it should be on the other end? So that's something that I think that is not unique to New York City or unique to this particular part of our city's government. In general, right? Like government focusing on organizations and places that have demonstrated that they can provide quality service, right? And impact, not just, widgets like inputting into a system, but like, what is the throughput? What are they once they're out of that program, right? Like, what are you measuring? And how do you define success, right? In that program? Is it that they were sheltered that night? Or is it that they were sheltered and moved through the shelter system, had a shorter length of stay than other programs, right? That's another measurement, which saves the city money in the end and leads to better outcomes for that person's life.
Sure.
So how do we move towards that versus, okay, person has been sheltered for the night, right? And support those organizations that are doing more of the impact, right?
Well, and I've thought about this a lot with a lot of things around government, and I don't care what level of government it may be. But just focusing on this particular issue, why is New York City actually in the homeless game when there's so many organizations out there like yours that are showing that they have successful models to where the city could say, okay, we're going to let nonprofit organizations, we're going to give you contracts, and here are the goals that you have to meet to maintain these contracts.
I mean, that's essentially what they do. I mean,
it just get out of it entirely to where the city doesn't even have shelter organizations. They may have shelter representatives to get people who come off the bus or all of a sudden lose their apartment to point them in the right direction to organizations like yours, but not necessarily maintain those facilities to where, like you said, okay, they were sheltered for the night and good, we checked that box.
Well, as it stands right now, I mean, that's what happens, right? So DHS contracts with organizations to provide services, but different organizations provide those services differently. And with all contracts, right? Again, this is not unique to New York City or to the Department of Homeless Services, but with all contracts, what are you measuring, right? How do you measure success? And I think that is like a really important question for, whether you're a private institution or a government and bureaucratic institution, how do you measure success? Is it just, that you achieve the goal of the function of that program, or is it longer term? And what you're doing is to move the person through the system as quickly as possible and on to further treatment or to further success towards their goal.
So of the people who make it through your program and let's say get their own apartment, have a job and what have you, do you have any numbers? And again, I didn't send you this question, it just popped into my head. Do you have any data that shows how many of them wind up back on the street eventually?
Yeah, so I mean, I have some of the retention numbers in my head, not all. So
that's okay, I'll take what you got.
For our folks that move on to permanent supportive housing, we have really high retention rates. We aren't able to measure like 10, 20 years down the line, but we do have 1 year retention data, and over 90% of our clients remain in permanent housing when there's strong supportive services. A lot of times the situations where folks end up back on the street involve like the type of things where it's like family reunification, right? Where somebody, they're out of the shelter system, they've reunited with their family, but perhaps the underlying issue of why they became into a situation where they were experiencing homelessness wasn't addressed fully. So that makes it hard to sustain the relationship with the family. They end up back on the street or back into the shelter system, or they're not in permanent housing that has enough supports for them to sustain their success, which is why, the real, and I know we'll get to this question later, I'm sure, but like, can this crisis be solved, right? It's like, well, there was more.
Hey, no cheating. That's my last question. So
yeah, we need more quality programs. is the sneak peek, but
okay. I'll let you get away with that one. Well, actually, so where is your housing? Where do
It's all over the city.
okay.
So we have scatter site housing, right? So depending on your level of stability, we have, so scatter site housing will be apartments scattered in like certain neighborhoods. So it won't be, it's not like one building where everybody is in this program. And then you'll have visits, regular visits from program staff to check in on you. Like I think I alluded to earlier, like, how are you doing? How are you feeling? Looking for any red flags where this person might be not doing so great, and let's catch them before they fall kind of situation. Then we have more supportive programs where you're living in single room, SROs, single occupancy rooms, and have like a common space, right, that you share together, and that there's like
kind of like a dorm.
Yeah, in a way, where there's strong supportive services. There's ones where everybody has their own little apartment. And then there's a supportive community center in the middle. But we're all over the city. BRC specifically we're in 4 out of the 5 boroughs. We're not on Staten Island. Staten Island has its own kind of its own services. Yeah.
For those of us in New York City, Staten Island is like its own little world. So I mean, it's its own universe in and of itself, and that's not
Verrazano Bridge is a bridge that if you could avoid with like the plague, any New Yorker does, right?
I mean, it's because it's its own little world. In fact, it's tried several times to secede from the city because it really is its own city. Because geographically, it's nowhere close to any of the boroughs, except it's closer to New Jersey than it is any of the other boroughs. Okay, so we are in 2021. You and I, before I hit record, we're talking about vaccines. So we're still in the era of to where COVID is a big deal. What was the impact for your organization and for homelessness in New York City of COVID?
Sure. So the impact was profound, I think, as expected. First of all, most of the shelters that BRC runs, and many in the city, are congregate living facilities,
right.
Where there could be, many people, sometimes, up to 20 in a room, in like a dormitory kind of style, like one room. And obviously with COVID and its transmission rates, that is not a great situation, both for clients who are living there and for staff that are providing services. So the city made a decision to reduce the congregate population by moving many folks into hotel rooms. So it was kind of like a mutually beneficial situation. No tourists, no business folks were coming to New York, particularly last spring, but certainly for the last year. And so the hotel industry was reeling, and there was this huge need of where are we going to put folks? How are we going to make people be safe in a safe living environment? So that was a huge shift because many of our shelters, it's not that they closed, it's just that the numbers were reduced in the location that they were in, and the rest of the clients were moved to hotel rooms. But what does that mean? It's not like we doubled our staff, right? We still, in many cases, we still needed staff at both locations. So that has been challenging. It's a challenge that we've risen to. But, having folks, particularly folks that have behavioral health issues, isolated in a room is not ideal from a service perspective, from a supportive services perspective. So we've had to really innovate and adapt to help to continue to serve them in the quality that we want to provide. We also had to adapt rapidly to make serving safe for our staff and for the clients that are being served. These are frontline staff. These are folks that are in congregate shelter systems. These are folks that are providing outreach services in the subways and transit hubs. And how can we make them feel safe and ensure their safety to the best of our ability? And this was all kind of happening on the fly. So it was really kind of fascinating to be a worm inside the apple and see how an organization, when pushed, when has the desire and and the kind of fortitude to say, we're going to do this. We're not going to make any excuses. We're going to get this done for our clients and for our city. And we're going to do it in a way that our staff safety is ensured. At a time when getting PPE, figuring out how to cover for staff shortages, because there were staff that were exposed to COVID and who got COVID, right? and providing healthcare to staff day one when they started. It used to be that you had to wait 3 months to get it.
People don't know how big of a deal that is, making that change for that waiting period and whatnot on insurance benefits. But speaking from experience, it's sort of a pain.
Oh yeah. And it was, it was an organizational decision that, like, no matter what this cost us, like, we had to do this for our staff. We could not ask our staff to serve under these circumstances without healthcare.
Yep.
But so that's how it, from a logistical perspective, it was a monumental task. And it also changed in a dramatic way. As a New Yorker, that one of the things that makes New York is it's the city that never sleeps. Why does it never sleep? One of the big reasons is because we have a transit system that runs 24 hours a day.
Right.
So you could be out, you can, work the overnight shift, or you could be out with your friends, you could do whatever. And then at 3 o'clock in the morning, you can get home, that changed under COVID. The MTA began shutting down the subways between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. For cleaning and sterilization and all that kind of stuff. But what does that mean for the folks that are living on the trains? And our outreach workers. So we had to pivot and create more stabilization beds. Stabilization beds are kind of another example of a harm reduction model of, offering a bed first and supportive services when that client is ready to receive them. But for the first time, so folks were all of a sudden at 1 a.m. I went out many times with our outreach teams to see what it was like and to offer help, because at first there was a lot of kind of press trying to get involved, and our staff were just trying to do their jobs and not have to worry about interacting with press. For the first time, people are being forced off, they are sleeping, and it's like, okay, you need to
gotta go.
Get out.
Yeah.
And so it was a really strong joint effort with the NYPD and the MTA and our outreach teams from other organizations to get to safely, effectively, respectfully get people off the trains, get them into a stabilization bed. Many of those people returned after they could. Because that is their home, that has been their home. It's not an overnight change. But there's people who decided to stay, who were, because they had this opportunity at a stabilization bed and supportive services, they were able to move on on the journey of reclaiming their life.
Yeah.
But those are just some of the ways that COVID has affected, the machinations of bureaucracy slowed down. Of course, I think everything slowed down. So accessibility to finding affordable housing was more challenging. Getting people's housing packets through slowed down, right? So folks who kind of did everything right and achieved their stability, ready to move out on their own, there was less opportunity to do so, and it was slow, and it's been slower to kind of achieve that goal. So, working with clients and working with staff, like our staff, this is hard work. I like working. So I have the easy job. I'm in the ivory tower, so to speak, but our folks who are on the field, who day in and day out are working with our clients. And oftentimes it's one step forward, 2 steps back, and having the patience and the fortitude and the kindness and the love, to be patient, to know that win is going to come, that success is going to come. Even though there's setbacks, we got to get there. This has been hard for everybody, because it's harder to achieve those things right now, and you want to keep positive, you want to keep optimistic. So I think the big story for me in the past year was that not much changed at BRC, even though a lot changed, right? We had to adapt, and a lot of our programs had to change the way they worked, but the clients are still achieving success. They're achieving stability. They're moving forward in recovery and, in sustaining their health, employment, all those kind of things, despite all the challenges around us.
So I want to pick up on something, and it is one of my questions that you just said about affordable housing. So in New York City, San Francisco, 2 major U.S. cities that have large homeless populations, but also very high real estate costs. San Francisco is even higher than New York in many respects. How big of an issue is affordability? And how do you make affordability affordable when it's very difficult to build apartment units in New York City, because just from the lack of land, it's very expensive to build anything if you want to make it affordable or not in this city. So how big of a problem is it? And then are there potential answers that you can think of, or BRC has approached to that issue?
So affordability is, I would probably say, the number one obstacle for people trying to get out of experiencing homelessness. And it's
even
often
more than mental health.
Absolutely, because they're not necessarily separate from each other, right?
Okay.
So first of all, like that, the average studio in New York City costs over $1,600 a month. So if you're somebody who's working a minimum wage job, even with minimum wage being $15 an hour, you still can't afford you still cannot afford a studio apartment in New York City, and afford to feed yourself and get healthcare and all these other, just basic needs, right?
Yeah.
So there's a huge affordable housing crisis in New York City, period. So if you and even those that are housed, right, who are not experiencing homelessness, there's a huge percentage, I believe it's over 50% or around 50% of New Yorkers are paying more than 30% of their salary on rent, which is
I've seen that number too.
Right. So what does that mean? That means that if there is some sort of economic crisis that happens, you lose a job, somebody gets sick and can't work as much, or whatever, all of a sudden that puts you at risk of experiencing homelessness far more than other places, right? Because you're already spending so much of your money on rent, and now you have less money, and now you can't afford rent at all. So affordable housing is a huge, huge issue. How do you solve it? I think there's a couple of ways that you solve it. One of them is putting a priority on building housing with supportive services. So that, to go to your question, like mental health issues, right? There are folks that are that have a permanent mental health condition that makes it unrealistic for them to be able to work, or work in a way that they could afford to sustain themselves. So their main income might be Social Security or other benefits like that. So creating more places where people like that can go live in a quality program where there's people who are caring for them, and making sure that they are sustaining their behavioral health issue and their housing status is key. And how do you do that? To your question, in a place where it's so expensive to build and there's only so much land, there's more opportunities than you would think. And I think that perhaps in this COVID crisis, that is one benefit that may come out of this, is that there'll be more opportunities to take buildings or to take space that maybe before a private developer would have built on. But there'll be more opportunities to build affordable housing. So BRC, for example, I think I mentioned earlier that we use data to solve issues and challenges. So one thing that we noticed in the data is that this was about 5 years ago, we noticed this trend that our clients were languishing in the shelter system longer than they used to. So their average length of stay in shelter was getting longer. We want it to get shorter, certainly not get longer, right? And we said, why is that? And the affordable housing issue is what came up. So these are folks that have been, who receive supportive services, who achieve stability, who are ready to move on to permanent housing, but they cannot afford to do so, right? There's just a lack of affordable housing. So what we did was we developed this model that Mayor de Blasio put as the cornerstone of his housing policy, which is our land. So we have at Landing Road in the Bronx, we have a model where we built a 200-bed employment shelter. And the revenue from that shelter, because usually the revenue goes to a private landlord, right? It's a good gig. You buy a building, you get a 30-year contract with the city, they pay the rent, right? And after 30 years, you've got that asset, and the city just paid for your mortgage plus extra income. Yep. And we have nothing against private landlords making money, but we said, wait, why why are they making money? We're the ones providing the service. We're the one who's running the building. Like, what can we do better? So we build it. So this is a 200-bed shelter attached to 135 units of permanent housing. The income, the surplus from the shelter contract, instead of going into the pocket of a private landlord, goes to offset the rents at those apartments, so that folks who've done everything right, who are working, or who have achieved stability and have a stable income through benefits or through work, can now have a place that they could afford to live, because the rent has been offset by the income from the shelter. So we are looking to build many more of these around the city, and we're not looking to hoard this kind of innovation. We want to share this innovation with other organizations around the city, around the country, and around the world, so that we can really start alleviating homelessness in a meaningful way.
So two thoughts come to mind, because this is the first I'm hearing about this kind of arrangement. So the first one is, does the private landlord manage the building?
Oh, it's in very minimal ways, right? So like if something, if an elevator breaks or whatever,
well, you live in a building that we both know intimately that it costs money every day to manage that building, because there is something every day going on, and we don't have, it's not 200 beds. It's only 62 units, so it's actually smaller.
Let's just say that the program works hand in hand with the landlord. Oftentimes the program is the one that is managing, getting reimbursement through Department of Homeless Services or other organizations that are involved, other, not organizations, but branches of the government that are helping to, that help to run the program and to pay for the expenditures necessary to run the program. So it's not a bad gig, if you want to get into that.
But then what happens at the end of the contract? Can the landlord kick out the shelter?
Sure. After the contract, yeah.
Yeah. So after 30 years.
These are often 20, 30-year contracts. They're long contracts.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, after a contract, you're a private landlord. Like if you decide that you don't want this program in your building anymore, you've just got your asset paid off in full, most likely.
But that's what I'm thinking about. I was thinking about that. Could you incentivize it even more to make the contracts longer? Because 30 years sounds like a long time, but when it comes to an actual physical building, especially here in New York City, 30 years is sometimes only 30% of the lifetime of the building.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, that's not my area of expertise in terms of like whether the government, whether the city should extend contracts.
Yeah, but you brought it up. You made me curious about it. What do you can't do that.
Oh, but I don't. I listen. I got to be honest. I can't be like, here's what I think when I don't know.
Yeah, no, I got you. But I do find it curious, because now all of a sudden I'm running the numbers in my head, and I'm trying to figure out, from your point of view, I could see the benefit immediately, but now I'm trying to see the benefit from the private developer's point of view. Do they stay in after the 30 years?
They can. I mean, sometimes they do, because it's a great income generator. They may sell the building, they may choose to develop the building, into something else. It's their property.
Yeah, and the other thing that I thought about was obviously, and maybe some of our viewers who are outside of New York City might not know about it, but the real problems of NYCHA, which is the New York City Housing Authority, and when they manage a building or own a building, those buildings are disasters, really. They're, in some instances, they should not be inhabited, because they don't even pass inspection for what the city claims every other building has to pass. And I always think about that, to make sure. That's why I asked to make sure the developer, the private owner, managed the building, because we've had way too many experiences in the New York City managing buildings that the buildings just fall apart. That goes back to your sort of what the end goals are. Do you just want to check off a box and say we got them off the street for a night? Or do you want to check off a box to say we've got them into permanent housing, they have a job, and they're back on their feet and living a life that we think.
I believe wholeheartedly that, the city, and I'm sure in other cities, the goal, is not just to check off the box, but sometimes that's just what inadvertently happens, right? When you have contracts, and when you have various providers providing that, those services, like they're not always going to be even. And that's why, again, like we're very much pushing for kind of quality over quantity, and effort over impact over effort, right? Don't just measure the effort, but measure, reward those organizations that are having really great outcomes.
Well, for returning visitors, they may have heard me say this before. You may have never heard me say this. I'm an avowed cynic. So when it comes to anything to the government and what have you, I am cynical to the nth degree, but hopeful in that regard, especially talking to you, because that was the reason why I wanted to bring you on, because I hope viewers understand that you have a calling. You can tell by the way you talk about this and a topic that most people just want to avoid and not think about, that you actually have a passion and a calling for it. And I think more people should appreciate that there are people out there trying to make an effort to solve this problem. And that will lead me to my last question, because as I look at it, we're already at 45 minutes.
Oh my
And we could go on longer, but I do want to be respectful of your time and everybody watching. So I never believe a problem like homelessness is 100% solvable.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm going to turn it and give you the last word on this question. Is it a solvable problem?
So, I think the answer is yes and no, right? I think in the short term, we're not going to get rid of homelessness. It's not going to just disappear. And it goes back to kind of my original statement, which is what causes homelessness? It's institutional failures in our systems, in our society, that brings people to our door, ultimately. As long as we have inadequate mental health care, as long as we have inadequate ways of addressing addiction, right? We treat addiction in many ways like as a crime.
Yeah.
Right. Not a public health issue. And there's a lot of nuance depending on which way you choose to treat it. If it's a public health issue and we understand that this is something that a certain percentage of society is just going to struggle with, there'll be very different outcomes, right, for folks that struggle with addiction. For as long as there's all these institutional failures that lead people to our door, whether it's racism, whether it's criminalizing poverty, right, all these different things, there's going to be homelessness. Like one thing that our CEO often likes to say is uses the hospital model, right? If you go to a hospital today, Sean, what will you see in the hospital?
Hopefully not myself, to be perfectly honest.
Right, but you'll probably see some sick people, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And 20 years from now, if you go to that same hospital, you'll still see sick people there.
Right.
It probably won't be the same sick people. And that doesn't mean that hospital isn't doing great work, right? It just means that there are sick people and they need to be treated, right?
Yep.
So for as long as there's those issues, and for as long as society, we as a society are willing to accept seeing homeless people on the street, right? Because that's the thing, is the second people say, no more, there won't be homelessness anymore. But we're not at that point yet, right? So, but in the short term.
Well, can I stop you there real quick, because I want to ask you about that. Is it because homelessness is really an urban problem?
I mean, you see it on a wider scale in urban environments, but homelessness is not new to New York City. It's not, even
it's
though
not new to the human race. I mean, there's been homelessness.
Exactly. Right. So when I say that there won't be
today.
homelessness anymore, I mean on the scale that we see it. But I think the answer is, I think we've touched many of these points throughout our discussion today, but I think the answer is be willing to put the resources necessary to support organizations that have strong outcomes for our clients and for our city, right? Because every life that we improve and every life that gets reclaimed at BRC or at another organization is improving the life of our whole city, and it's making our city a more compassionate and better place to live. So having the political will to say we're going to put our money where our mouth is, we're going to build more models like the Landing Road model. We are going to build more supportive communities and supportive programs so that people can live in their own home and have the support that they need to stay there, right? And that's when you'll see a real change in homelessness in our city and in our country. In other cities like LA, addiction is plays a huge role, like a bigger role than it does even in a place like New York. So they have different challenges, but it's all comes to the same root of like, where is the political will to address it in meaningful ways, not in check the box, we're offering this service, or we're giving you a bed, but we are offering a profound continuum of services to truly help address the issues that led you here. And then help, and those same services to help sustain you so that you can continue to move forward with this better life.
Well, I certainly hope people have a newfound appreciation for the folks that are out there trying to actually put a dent in the homeless population, because this was fantastic. You've actually got me all fired up now. I'm all curious about stuff around this issue, and not just the gentleman who I see on a daily basis out on Broadway, and just I marvel at the world that he's created for himself. And while I don't know if it's right for me to stop and talk to him or not, but watching him from afar, you could see that it is a problem and it's not a problem for him. And you just don't know which way to go. But if I gave you carte blanche, I'm pretty sure we'd have an answer pretty quick. But I don't have that kind of power.
What I'll leave you with about that, I don't know that gentleman, I don't know his story, but just knowing the people that we serve, I guarantee you that I would be surprised if there wasn't a strong history of trauma there, of probably post-traumatic stress in a very real and severe way. And that he is not that different than you or me. And I think that's one of the biggest obstacles, in my role, that I am always looking to overcome, which is that homeless people are people just like all of us. They, for the various reasons that led them to the experience that they're having right now, is because they didn't have the social safety net that maybe other people that we know who have struggled with. We all know people who've struggled with mental illness or depression or anxiety or addiction or lost a job, or were in a bad relationship or a bad living situation, how to get out of it. And what differentiated them from somebody who's living on the streets or who's in the shelter system is that they had a different support system that either gave them the tools to know how to get out of that situation or helped get them out of that situation and stay out of that situation. So for me, if all that we achieved today on this call is that a little bit of the mask has been removed from the face of folks that are experiencing homelessness, to understand that they are part of our society, they are part of us, and that New York is a place that a lot of people come to achieve success. And it's really great to those people who
make it
success, but that we all bear this kind of, and I say it in a positive way, not in this burden, but we have a responsibility to be there for each other as a community and to uplift one another, because when we do that, it's a better city and a better home to live for everybody.
Well, on that note, actually, you should check out an episode I did with a woman by the name of Fran Harding, and her entire career was about addiction prevention.
Oh, cool.
It was a very interesting conversation about how do you prevent something you're not sure somebody has. And so, but you have been fantastic, exactly as I knew you would be, because Shira and I actually live on the same floor in the same building. In Queens. So, but I really want to thank you. This was quite enlightening, and I got to 5 of the 7 questions. I am very proud of myself.
Impressive. Thank you, Sean. It was really fun to talk with you, and hopefully I will see you soon.
I'm pretty sure you will, because I have to come home today. Luckily, you and I have a solid place to live. But I want to thank Shira for doing this. I hope you got something out of it. If you were able to watch this all the way through, you can see the passion she brings to a very complicated topic. As I promised you, there's no easy answer, but she did give us a bunch of ideas. And if you're so inspired, her contact information will be below. Feel free to reach out to Shira to talk to her about the topic. And for all of you who tuned in, for all of you who watched all the way through, I want to thank you very much. You've been watching Did You Know That? ? If you are so inclined, be sure to subscribe with the bell. See, I'm pointing to it right below, right there. so that you get notified of future episodes on Thursday mornings. And if you've liked this conversation or previous episodes, be sure to give us a like because it would really help the channel. So for Shira Fisher, I am Sean O'Rourke, and we are signing off until next time.